Hi everybody, Terry Ryder from Hotspotting, bringing you this week's edition of the War on Misinformation. And I want to give you some of the good news stories that you probably haven't seen or heard because primarily mainstream media hasn't told you about them because essentially and fundamentally they're not interested in good news. There's this obsession, particularly now more than ever before, God knows why, with bad news, with negativity. And to the extent that even when the news is actually positive, media will go out of their way to find a way to turn it into a negative. And a shining example of that very recently was the latest figures on unemployment. Now, what the figures actually showed is that the jobless rate officially, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, has fallen below 5%. It's now officially 4.9%, and it's the lowest it's been since 2011, so the lowest for 8 years. That's a pretty good news story, right? Actually, no. Media managed to turn that into a negative. And here's a headline I have here in front of me from news.com.au. That's News Limited, the biggest media organisation in the country. How they managed to turn this positive news story into a negative. Their headline said, "Bad news hidden in good job figures." In other words, they weren't searching for the negative. And when they found it, they highlighted that. There actually, when you read the article, there actually is no bad news in there, except that, as is always the case, no matter what statistics come out, there'll always be an economist wanting to stand up and warn that, oh yeah, the figures are good, but there's something negative on the horizon. Here was another headline: "Caution surrounds record jobs data." Okay, so very positive story, very positive outcome for the economy and for people looking for work, that unemployment is so low. But media went out of their way to turn it into a negative. They did the same things with the latest figures on economic growth. For the latest quarter, there was economic growth continuing Australia's remarkable record of more than a quarter of a century with continual economic growth, which makes us one of the most prosperous and stable nations on the planet. But with those latest figures on economic growth, media turned it into a negative by concocting the new idea of a per capita recession. I don't know about you, but I'd never heard of such a concept. Neither anybody else. Based on my reading, it was something that media sort of concocted to turn that positive into a negative. They did the same thing with the latest jobs figures. I'll give you that headline again: "Bad news hidden in good jobs figures." They really had to go looking for it, but they succeeded, as they always do. Here's another example. Here's a story about a real estate market in Victoria where the data is really, really strongly positive, and the headline in Melbourne media was just so muted. It was talking about the Melton market, which is in the western fringe of the Melbourne metropolitan area. Now, it's one of those markets in Melbourne, despite the media rhetoric about prices falling across Melbourne, not true. The cheaper areas are still actually have prices rising because there's strong activity from first-home buyers in those areas. Now, Melton is probably the most remarkable of those areas because prices are really up very strongly. But the very muted headline said, Melton prices steady. Steady means they haven't changed. Well, in actual fact, that was a gross understatement of the situation. In the suburb of Melton, its median price in the last 12 months is up 20%. Melton South is up 16%. The suburb of Kurrajong, which is part of that market, is up virtually 20%. And Melton West is up 14%. So the weakest of those markets rose 14% in the last 12 months. So very, very strong price growth still happening in Melton, as it is in other outer ring areas of the Melbourne market, of which Melton is the most impressive with this price growth in the last 12 months. But again, a very sort of muted, almost begrudging acknowledgement that something positive is happening out there in the property market. Media just can't really bring themselves to admit to positive things happening. So some of the stories that you won't know about because media hasn't been reporting them, simply because they're positives. We know about them because we research extensively. We gather information from all the sources that are out there. We get all the material that's pumped out by research organisations, by the Bureau of Statistics, etc., and we make use of it for what we do in compiling our reports for property consumers. But a lot of these stories just haven't been written by our major newspapers and other forms of mainstream media like the ABC, which isn't interested in anything about real estate unless it's a screaming negative. So here are the stories that you won't know about because media hasn't told you about them, but nevertheless, they're factual. Now, one of the things that's very strong about real estate markets at the moment is land prices. Even though in some of our two biggest cities in particular, there is a downward trend with prices, particularly in Sydney, land prices are defying that trend. And likely it's because I think that in our major cities, we have very strong population growth, very strong demand for land, and land supply isn't keeping up. And also the costs of creating new land are very high because the costs are loaded up with government impost, taxes, fees and charges at all levels of government, which is the nub of the housing affordability issue, although politicians will never admit that to you. So we have a situation where in Melbourne, even though the general trend for Melbourne prices is down, Melbourne land prices are rising still very strongly, and that's the case across Australia, generally speaking. So in the latest quarter, there was a further smallish 1% rise in the average price for housing allotment across Australia. So the average housing allotment in Australia now costs about $280,000. We have this strange phenomenon: the lots keep getting smaller and smaller, but the prices keep getting higher and higher. And that's because of the bureaucratic processes, the costs that are lumped onto the housing industry. That means it's very hard to produce a decent block of land for a decent price. So land prices continue to rise, but media hasn't told you about that. The other thing that's very positive about our major city markets is rentals. Rentals are rising in most of our capital cities, and that's primarily because vacancies are very low. Now, we'll just find that particular. There's two major sources that we've published recently on rental figures. One is SQM Research, and this most recent story comes from the website rent.com.au, saying very similar things to what we've published from SQM Research. That is that capital city rents are up in most capital cities, not all, and according to the rent.com.au figures, rents have risen quite strongly in the last 12 months, and also in the most recent month, which is under review, which is February, in Sydney, Canberra, Hobart, Darwin, Melbourne and Adelaide. The biggest increases on a per room basis have been in Hobart, up 8%, and Sydney up 4%. Now that is confirmed by the figures that were previously published by SQM Research, which is a really good source of information of all sorts about real estate data in markets right across Australia. And what they show is that vacancies are very low in most of our cities. In Melbourne, Hobart, Canberra and Adelaide, they've all got vacancy rates below 1.8%, which begins to explain why rents are rising quite solidly at a time where prices are generally not rising strongly, apart from, well, in Hobart they still are. Canberra's pretty solid. But against that generalised trend of decline in prices, rents are doing something quite different. Okay, so another sort of positive outcome is that things are happening a little bit better with prices than mainstream media have us believe, because they keep publishing headlines about prices just falling everywhere. The generalised figure published by most sources for the capital cities is a negative figure. Therefore, they say Australian property prices are falling, but that negative figure is created by the weight of Sydney, where prices are down the most. And we still have capital city markets where prices are still rising. Now, SQM Research recently published its latest figures on the capital city markets. 16 capital city markets. Each of the 8 capital cities has a house market and an apartment market, and according to the SQM Research figures, 8 of those 16 capital city markets have prices higher than 12 months ago. And then, of course, we have the situation with regional Australia, which is where most of the the strong growth markets actually exist at the moment and not getting any airplay at all. Now, that was kind of confirmed. Those figures from SQM Research were largely confirmed by the latest report from the Real Estate Institute of Australia. It's Real Estate Market Facts, showing the December quarter prices rose in 3 of the capital cities, which indicates that they didn't rise in 5 of them, but again, sort of putting the light of that general notion of mainstream media that prices are falling everywhere. The Real Estate Institute report also noted the strength of prices in many areas of regional Australia, and they singled out regional Victoria, where markets like Geelong, Bendigo and Ballarat have strongly rising prices, and a similar trend in New South Wales, confirmed by our own town-by-town, suburb-by-suburb research recently, showing that 85% of locations in regional Australia have recorded price growth in the past 12 months. So just another of those stories that you're not going to be hearing about. We've talked about land prices, we've talked about rentals. Strong population growth is another very positive thing that that we're highlighting because it's so important to real estate markets. Australian population has now topped 25 million, and the growth is being led by Victoria, which is getting strong growth from overseas migration as well as net interstate migration. New South Wales is having good growth mainly through overseas migration, because net and interstate migration for New South Wales is a negative. Queensland's also growing strongly. It's gaining the most from net interstate migration at the moment, as well as some from overseas migration, and then the third factor is natural increase. But the Australian population continues to grow strongly, led by Victoria and the ACT, but not particularly well highlighted by media, who's not interested in positive stories. Something very positive for the housing markets generally, particularly for investors, came out of ANZ recently, where they announced that they're easing their restrictions or their criteria for lending to investors, including interest-only mortgages, longer periods for interest-only mortgages, and also smaller deposits. They previously required 20%, now they're accepting 10%. So the ANZ has been probably leading the major banks in admitting that they had previously been perhaps overly cautious with their lending criteria in response to what was revealed by the Banking Royal Commission. And so they're now easing up, and that's a very, very good sign. We expect to see more of that coming out of the major banks as we move forward, because that's been one of the hindering factors of allowing people out there in real estate markets to do what they'd really like to be doing, buying and selling. Okay. There was also a story out this week from Finder, one of the comparison websites, where they did a survey of people with mortgages, asking them just how easy they're finding to pay the mortgage. Can they make their repayments comfortably was one category. Another category was, finding it a little bit difficult, but finding enough. And then there was a third category, barely able to make their repayments every month. And finally, no, we're behind on our repayments. Now, interesting that in most cities, only 1 or 2% of people were behind on their repayments. Over 90% in all our major cities are either making their repayments comfortably or are finding enough to make their repayments. Headed by Brisbane, 62% of Brisbane respondents with mortgages say they can make their repayments comfortably. And then there's another 32% of Brisbane respondents saying that they are finding enough to make their repayments and not finding it particularly difficult. So there's another positive story, and that's confirmed by the regular data that's produced by some of the ratings agencies about mortgage delinquencies. Typically in Australia, mortgage delinquencies delinquencies means people are behind on their mortgage repayments. They tend to be about 1% or 1.5%. They hover between those two figures, which means that close to 99% of people are paying on time. And that's confirmed pretty much by this survey by Finder. So despite all the negative media about how high our debt levels and how there's negative sentiment out there, people, according to all the data, including this latest survey by Finder, are primarily comfortable making the mortgage repayments. In fact, other research shows that most households in Australia with a mortgage are ahead on their repayments. They've actually made extra repayments, and I think the average situation is a couple of years ahead. So plenty of positive stories out there. Rents are rising, vacancies are low, land prices are rising. Half of our capital city markets have prices higher than 12 months ago, according to SQM research. Population growth is still strong. Lenders are starting to ease up with their lending. Lots of positive things, but you ain't going to hear about it very much from our major newspapers or other forms of mainstream media, who are just addicted to negativity, which just adds to what I call the great seething mass of media misinformation. And I urge you to try to look beyond it and to ignore it. That's it for now. Terry Ryder from Hotspotting signing off. Let's do it again soon.